Welcome back to part 3 of this deep dive series. Let's pick up where we left off. By the time gold-backed digital money collapsed, the problem was no longer theoretical. Digital value could exist, it could move online, it could scale globally, and it could also be shut down the moment it developed a center. That much was now beyond debate. The question had changed. It was no longer whether digital money was possible, but whether it could exist without asking permission from anyone at all, and without creating a single point of failure that would eventually be targeted. This is where the story shifts away from companies, vaults, and visible platforms, and into something quieter and far more important. Because the next phase of digital money didn't come from entrepreneurs trying to build products. It came from ideas exchanged in mailing lists, academic circles, and obscure corners of the early internet. Long email threads, half-finished proposals, thought experiments written by people who weren't trying to get rich, weren't chasing adoption, and weren't even sure their ideas would ever work in practice. They were trying to solve a puzzle that history had now made brutally clear. How do you create money on the internet without trusting anyone? The problem sounds simple when stated plainly, but it was vicious in practice. How do you stop digital money from being copied endlessly like any other file? How do you prevent double spending without a bank watching every transaction? How do you get thousands, eventually millions, of strangers to agree on who owns what without relying on a central referee? And perhaps most difficult of all, how do you design a system that still works when people behave selfishly, dishonestly, or maliciously? One of the first ideas that genuinely mattered in this phase didn't even begin as a money project. It was called Hashcash, and it was created to solve a completely different problem: spam. Email was cheap to send, which made mass spam profitable. So the idea was to introduce a small cost. Before sending a message, your computer would have to perform a modest amount of computational work, solving a cryptographic puzzle, and include proof that the work had been done. Verifying the proof was easy. Creating it required effort. Sending one message was trivial. Sending millions became expensive. What Hashcash accidentally revealed was profound. Computation could be used as a scarce resource. Something purely digital could be made costly to produce, but easy to verify. Scarcity no longer had to come from physical objects or central issuers. It could come from energy and time. That idea didn't disappear. It lingered, waiting for a different context. Around the same time, other thinkers were approaching the problem from a different direction. Wei Dai proposed a system he called B-money. It wasn't a product or even a fully specified protocol. It was a description of how a community of pseudonymous participants might maintain a shared ledger of balances without relying on any central authority. Transactions would be broadcast. Participants would keep their own records. Rules would be enforced cryptographically rather than institutionally. B-money was radical because it reframed money as a protocol rather than a service. There was no bank, no company, no vault. Just a network of peers agreeing on balances. But it was also incomplete. It didn't fully explain how disagreements would be resolved, how consensus would be reached when participants saw conflicting information, or how the system would behave under attack. It described the destination clearly, but left the hardest part, how to get there, unresolved. Now before we get to the next part, we're going to take a short break for a word from our sponsors. Stay with us. Then the next major project came along, and that was BitGold. Nick Szabo's BitGold proposal came closer than almost anything before it to outlining what a non-centralized digital money system might look like. In BitGold, cryptographic puzzles would be solved, and each solution would be time-stamped and linked to the previous one, forming a chain. Solving these puzzles required computational effort, which created cost and scarcity. The history of solutions would be publicly verifiable and difficult to alter. Value emerged from work, and history emerged from chaining. If this sounds familiar, it's because the outline is unmistakable. Proof of work, time ordering, cryptographic scarcity. BitGold had all of these elements. What it didn't have was a fully decentralized way to agree on ownership and resolve conflicts. There was still an implicit reliance on trusted registries or external coordination to determine which chain was correct. And that missing piece was fatal. This is where every pre-Bitcoin system stalled. Not because the ideas were naive, but because they were unfinished. Proof of work could create cost, but not agreement. Distributed ledgers could record balances, but not enforce them without trust. Cryptography could secure messages, but not coordinate incentives at scale. The systems worked in theory, but theory breaks down the moment humans enter the picture. And the people working on these ideas understood that. They weren't building startups that failed to find product-market fit. They were deliberately documenting the edges of what was possible and what wasn't. They knew that any system which ignored incentives would collapse. That any system which assumed honest behavior would be gamed. That decentralization without economic gravity would fragment under pressure. This period wasn't a graveyard of bad ideas. It was a refinement process. Each proposal eliminated an entire class of solutions. Centralized systems failed because they could be shut down. Gold-backed systems failed because custody created choke points. Pure cryptographic systems failed because they couldn't coordinate behavior or resolve disagreement at scale. With every failure, the space of viable solutions became narrower and clearer. And then quietly, the pieces were combined. Bitcoin didn't succeed because it introduced one revolutionary concept. Proof of work already existed. Peer-to-peer networks already existed. Digital signatures were well understood. Time-stamped chains had been proposed. What Bitcoin did was combine these elements into a single system, where incentives, security, and consensus reinforced one another, rather than working at cross purposes. Instead of asking participants to trust a registry, Bitcoin asked them to trust cost. Instead of authority determining truth, economic weight did. The correct history wasn't the one approved by a company or institution, it was the one that was most expensive to fake. Consensus emerged not from permission, but from energy. That was the missing piece. Before Bitcoin, none of the systems solved all of these problems at once. They came close. Painfully close. But they always failed at the point where theory met human behavior. Bitcoin worked because it assumed selfishness, not cooperation, and made honesty the most profitable strategy. This is why Bitcoin feels inevitable in hindsight, but didn't feel obvious at the time. It wasn't a sudden invention. It was the final synthesis of decades of unresolved ideas, sharpened by repeated failure. The work of Hashcash, B-Money, and BitGold didn't disappear when Bitcoin arrived. It crystallized. By this point in the story, everything important was already on the table. Proof of work existed. Distributed networks existed. Cryptographic scarcity had been described. The failures were no longer mysterious. They were specific, repeatable, and painfully well understood. Every serious attempt had broken down at the same fault line: coordination, agreement, incentives strong enough to survive real-world behavior rather than idealized theory. What was missing wasn't intelligence or imagination. It was synthesis. A way to bind these ideas together into a system that didn't just work on paper, but worked because people acted in their own self-interest, rather than despite it. The cypherpunks were closer than anyone realized, but they were still one step short of something that could live on its own, without permission, without custody, and without a center that could be pressured into failure. And that's where this story pauses for now. Because the next chapter isn't about ideas floating on mailing lists anymore. It's about execution, about timing, about design choices that look subtle on the surface, but turned out to be decisive. In the next episode, we move to the moment those unfinished ideas finally collided with the right conditions, and something very different emerged. Until then, make sure you are following the show, and as always, we will see you at the top.